The autumn morning was crisp and cool when Derek walked through the old brick archway of Riverside University. His backpack hung loose on one shoulder, and his wireless earbuds played some low-key jazz as he made his way to Harrison Hall. It was his first day of college, and honestly, he was more excited than nervous. High school had been rough in its own ways, but college was supposed to be different. A fresh start. A place where people cared more about ideas than appearances. Room 304 was bigger than he expected. The lecture hall had those old-fashioned wooden seats that folded up when you stood, arranged in rising rows that faced a large blackboard. Derek grabbed a seat near the back, not because he wanted to hide, but because he liked having a view of everything. Plus, the acoustics were better for when professors actually said something worth hearing. Other students filtered in slowly. Some were chatting with friends they'd made during orientation week. Others looked as new as Derek felt, clutching their schedules and scanning room numbers twice to make sure they were in the right place. A girl with red hair sat 2 seats over and gave him a friendly nod. He nodded back, pulling out his notebook and a couple of pens. At exactly 9 o'clock, Professor Gerald Hutchinson walked in. The man was probably in his late 50s, wearing a tweed jacket with those leather patches on the elbows that Derek had only seen in movies about fancy British schools. His gray hair was combed back neatly, and he carried himself with the kind of stiffness that suggested he took himself very seriously. Professor Hutchinson set his leather briefcase on the desk with a decisive thump. His eyes swept across the room, taking in each student with what seemed like a measuring gaze. When his eyes landed on Derek, still wearing his hoodie with one earbud dangling from his collar, something shifted in his expression, not quite a frown, but definitely not approval. "Good morning," the professor began, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that some teachers wielded like a weapon. "Welcome to Advanced English Literature. I should tell you right now that this is not a class for the casual student. This is not a class where you can coast by on natural talent or charm. This is a class that demands dedication, intellectual rigor, and respect for the material we'll be studying." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then, almost casually, he added while looking directly at Derek's section of the room, "And it demands that you show up ready to learn. Not dressed like you just rolled out of bed, not listening to music when you should be focusing, but actually present and engaged." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Derek felt his face get warm, but he stayed quiet. He'd learned a long time ago that some battles weren't worth fighting on day one. He calmly removed his other earbud and tucked both into his pocket, maintaining eye contact with the professor the whole time. Professor Hutchinson turned to the blackboard and began writing the course outline in surprisingly neat handwriting. "We'll be covering postmodern narrative structures, deconstructionist theory, and the evolution of voice in contemporary literature. Your first assignment will be a 1,500-word essay analyzing the use of unreliable narration in postmodern fiction. I want you to choose a work we haven't discussed in class and break down how the author manipulates reader perception through narrative voice." He turned back to face the class, chalk dust on his fingers. "This essay is due in 2 weeks. No extensions, no excuses. And before anyone asks, yes, I do expect freshman-level work to meet graduate-level standards. That's how you grow as scholars and thinkers." The rest of the class period was spent going over the syllabus and discussing expectations. Professor Hutchinson had strong opinions about everything from proper citation format to the moral decay of modern publishing. He spoke about literature the way some people spoke about religion, with absolute certainty that there was a right way and a wrong way to understand it. Derek took notes quietly, writing down assignment dates and required readings. He noticed that whenever he raised his hand to ask a clarifying question, the professor's answers were shorter and less detailed than when other students asked similar things. When a blonde student in the front row asked about office hours, Professor Hutchinson spent 3 minutes explaining his availability and encouraging students to come by anytime they needed help. When Derek asked about the recommended reading list, he got a clipped response about checking the syllabus more carefully. By the time class ended, Derek had a pretty clear picture of how this semester was going to go. As students filed out, chattering about the course load and comparing schedules, he stayed back for a moment, looking at the lengthy reading list on the board. Some of the titles were familiar. Others he'd been meaning to read for months. Despite the professor's attitude, Derek couldn't help feeling a spark of excitement about the material itself. The girl with red hair caught up with him in the hallway. "That was intense," she said, falling into step beside him. Professor Hutchinson has a reputation for being tough, but I didn't realize he was also kind of judgmental. Derek offered with a slight smile. She laughed a little nervously. I was going to say old-fashioned, but yeah, that too. I'm Riley, by the way. Derek. They walked together toward the campus center, and Riley talked about her other classes and her plans to major in creative writing. Derek mostly listened, enjoying the easy conversation after the tension of the morning. He didn't mention that he'd already published work, or that he'd specifically chosen this university because of their literary connections. Those were things he preferred to keep private, at least until he knew people better. What he didn't know yet was just how much his decision to stay quiet would matter in the weeks to come, or that Professor Hutchinson's first impression of him was about to become a much bigger problem than just uncomfortable eye contact and short answers. The second week of classes felt longer than the first. Derek had settled into a routine, but advanced English literature remained the one class where he couldn't quite relax. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 o'clock, he walked into that lecture hall knowing he'd have to work twice as hard for half the recognition. It started small. Professor Hutchinson had a habit of mispronouncing Derek's last name, even after Derek corrected him politely on the second day of class. Wellington wasn't exactly difficult to say, but the professor kept calling him Willington or sometimes Worthington, like he couldn't be bothered to remember. Other students noticed. Riley started giving Derek sympathetic looks whenever it happened. Then there were the class discussions. Professor Hutchinson loved those. He'd throw out a question about the reading assignment and then sit back on the edge of his desk, waiting for students to engage in what he called scholarly discourse. Most students were too nervous to speak up. But Derek had always loved analyzing books. It was literally what he did for a living, though nobody in the class knew that. During a discussion about narrative perspective in modern fiction, Derek raised his hand. I think one interesting aspect we haven't touched on is how unreliable narration reflects cultural distrust of singular truth. In a lot of contemporary work, especially from marginalized voices, that unreliability becomes a tool for showing how different people experience reality differently based on their position in society. The room went quiet for a moment. A few students nodded, clearly interested in where the thought was going. Professor Hutchinson's expression, however, looked like he'd just tasted something sour. That's a very ambitious interpretation, the professor said slowly, with emphasis on the word ambitious that made it sound like an insult. But I think you might be reading politics into something that's really about craft and technique. Before we start making grand statements about society and marginalized voices, we need to understand the fundamentals of how narration actually works. Derek felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. I understand the technical aspects. I'm saying that technique and cultural context aren't separate things. Authors make deliberate choices that reflect their worldview. Professor Hutchinson waved his hand dismissively. Yes, well, that's a discussion for a sociology class, perhaps. In here, we focus on the literature itself. The text, not the subtext you'd like to impose on it. He turned to another student. Rebecca, what were your thoughts on the passage we read? Rebecca, a junior who sat in the front row, glanced nervously between Derek and the professor before offering a much safer interpretation that stuck closely to basic plot analysis. Professor Hutchinson praised her insight and spent the next 10 minutes building on her comment. This pattern repeated itself throughout the week. Derek would offer a thought, carefully considered and well articulated, and Professor Hutchinson would find a way to undercut it. Meanwhile, other students could say essentially the same thing in different words and receive encouragement. It was subtle enough that Derek sometimes wondered if he was being paranoid, but consistent enough that he knew he wasn't. Riley confirmed it after class on Friday. Okay, I'm not imagining this, right? She said as they walked across the quad. He's definitely harder on you than everyone else. Yeah, Derek admitted. I noticed. It's not fair. Your comments are always really insightful. That thing you said about narrative voice and cultural perspective, that was brilliant. I wrote it down in my notes. Derek appreciated her support, but he also knew this wasn't a new experience. He'd dealt with teachers like Hutchinson before, the ones who made assumptions based on how you looked, where you came from, how you dressed, the ones who expected less and then acted surprised when you delivered more, only to find new ways to diminish what you'd done. The real test came the following Wednesday. They were discussing contemporary African American literature, specifically a novel by a celebrated author who'd written about the Black experience in the rural South. Derek had read everything this author had written. He'd even cited her work in his own book. This was his area of expertise, whether Professor Hutchinson knew it or not. The discussion started well enough. Students shared their reactions to the book, talking about the beautiful prose and the powerful storyline. Then Professor Hutchinson asked a question about the author's use of dialect and whether it was authentic or performative. Derek's hand shot up. He had strong feelings about this, about how Black authors were always questioned about authenticity in ways white authors never were. I think we need to be careful about applying concepts like authenticity to how people write about their own communities, he began. This author grew up in the region she writes about. The dialect isn't performative. It's representative of real speech patterns that she heard and used herself. Questioning that authenticity puts Black writers in an impossible position where they're somehow not Black enough or too Black, depending on who's judging. Several students made sounds of agreement. One guy in the back said, "That's a really good point." Professor Hutchinson stood up from his desk, his face reddening slightly. "That's a nice try," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Derek's skin crawl. "But I think you're missing the literary complexity here. This isn't about race. It's about craft. Perhaps you should focus on understanding the basics of literary analysis before attempting to lecture the class on complex theoretical frameworks." The room went dead silent. A few students looked shocked. Riley's mouth actually fell open. Derek sat very still, processing what had just happened. The professor had essentially told him he wasn't smart enough to understand the book. In front of everyone. And he'd done it while discussing a Black author, dismissing Derek's perspective on the Black experience like it was naive and uninformed. "I understand the craft," Derek said quietly, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "I also understand the context. They're not mutually exclusive. Context is fine for a book club," Professor Hutchinson replied, turning back to the blackboard. "In an academic setting, we analyze literature through established critical frameworks. Now let's look at the structure of the narrative arc." He continued with the lecture as if nothing had happened, but Derek couldn't focus on another word. He took notes mechanically, his pen moving across the page while his mind raced. Around him he could feel other students' discomfort. A few kept glancing back at him. Riley looked furious on his behalf. After class, a small group gathered around Derek. Riley was there, along with two other students from the class, Tyler and Jessica. "That was completely out of line," Tyler said. "You weren't lecturing anyone. You were making a legitimate point." "He talks to you differently than everyone else," Jessica added. "We've all noticed." "It's not okay." Derek shrugged, trying to play it off even though he was still angry. "It's fine. I'm used to it." "That doesn't make it right," Riley insisted. "Have you thought about talking to someone? Like the department head or something?" "And say what? That the professor doesn't like my comments? That he's dismissive?" It's all subtle enough that he could just say I'm being oversensitive. But that night lying in his dorm room, Derek couldn't stop replaying the interaction. His roommate Chris had heard the whole story and was equally outraged. "You should tell him," Chris said, "about your books, about who you actually are." That would shut him up real quick. Derek had considered it, many times actually, but something about it felt wrong. Like he shouldn't have to prove his worth through his accomplishments. Every student in that class deserved respect, whether they'd published books or not. The moment he pulled out his credentials to defend himself, he'd be admitting that Hutchinson was right to treat people differently based on what he assumed about them. "I'll handle it my way," Derek said finally. What he didn't know was that things were about to get much worse before they got better, and that Professor Hutchinson's assumptions were about to backfire in a way neither of them could have predicted. The day the essays were due, Derek walked into class feeling confident. He'd spent 2 weeks crafting an analysis of unreliable narration that he was genuinely proud of. The paper examined 3 different contemporary novels, breaking down how each author used narrative perspective to challenge reader assumptions. It was tight, well-researched, and built on theories from several major literary critics. He'd written papers like this dozens of times before, though never for a grade. Professor Hutchinson collected the papers at the beginning of class, stacking them neatly on his desk. "I'll have these graded and returned by Friday," he announced. "I'm curious to see who actually understood the assignment and who simply regurgitated plot summaries from the internet." The class proceeded normally. They discussed a new short story, and Derek stayed quiet for most of it, only speaking when directly called upon. He'd learned that volunteering his thoughts just invited dismissal, so why bother? Let someone else get shot down for once. Friday came. Derek arrived a few minutes early, as usual. The classroom slowly filled with students, everyone buzzing with that nervous energy that comes with getting papers back. Professor Hutchinson entered exactly on time, carrying the stack of essays. "Overall, I was disappointed," he began, which seemed to be his favorite way to start any evaluation. "Most of you demonstrated a surface-level understanding at best. However, a few of you showed promise." He began distributing papers, calling out names, and handing them over with brief comments. "Rebecca, excellent work on your Fitzgerald analysis. Brian, your structure needs work, but your insights were solid." Derek watched as paper after paper was returned. Riley got hers back with a B+ and a note about developing her arguments more fully. Tyler got a B- and looked relieved. The stack got smaller and smaller, but Derek's name wasn't called. Finally, when everyone else had their papers, Professor Hutchinson set the remaining essay on his desk. "Mr. Wellington," he said, and something about his tone made Derek's stomach drop. "Please stay after class. We need to discuss your submission." The room went quiet. A few students exchanged glances. Riley looked worried. Derek nodded slowly, his mind already racing through possibilities. Had he made some formatting error? Forgotten to cite something? But he'd triple-checked everything. Class felt endless. Derek barely heard anything Professor Hutchinson said for the next hour. All he could think about was that paper sitting on the desk and the way the professor had said they needed to discuss it. When class finally ended, students filed out slowly, many of them shooting sympathetic looks Derek's way. Riley lingered by the door until Derek gave her a small nod that said he'd be okay. When the room was empty except for the two of them, Professor Hutchinson closed the door. He walked back to his desk, picked up Derek's essay and held it like it was contaminated. "I have to say, I'm very disappointed," the professor began. "But more than that, I'm concerned." "Concerned about what?" Derek asked, staying calm even as alarm bells went off in his head. "This paper." Professor Hutchinson tapped it with one finger. "It's far too sophisticated for a freshman. The analysis is graduate level. The writing style is polished in a way that suggests professional experience. The theoretical framework you've employed is something I wouldn't expect from even my senior students." Derek felt a confusing mix of pride and anger. "Thank you." "That wasn't a compliment," the professor said sharply. "It's a problem, because either you had substantial help writing this, or you didn't write it at all." The words hung in the air between them. Derek stared at the professor, not quite believing what he was hearing. "You think I plagiarized?" "I'm saying this paper doesn't match the level of discourse you've demonstrated in class. I'm saying it's suspiciously well written for someone with your background." "My background." Derek repeated the words slowly, letting them sit there. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Professor Hutchinson had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, but he pushed forward anyway. "You dress casually, you sit in the back of the class, your participation has been sporadic at best. Then suddenly you turn in work that reads like it came from a professional literary journal. You have to admit it raises questions." Derek's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice level. "What you're really saying is that you don't think someone who looks like me, who dresses like me, could possibly write at this level." "I'm saying the work doesn't match the student. If you can provide evidence that this is genuinely your own analysis, we can move forward. But right now, I have serious concerns about academic integrity." "Evidence," Derek said.
"What kind of evidence?"
Professor Hutchinson pulled out his laptop and opened it. "I did some preliminary searches. Some of your phrasing is similar to articles I've seen in literary journals. Your discussion of narrative unreliability parallels arguments made by published critics. It's all too convenient." "Which critics?" Derek asked. "I'd have to look up the specific names, but the similarity is there. I've been teaching this subject for 30 years. I know derivative work when I see it. So you're accusing me of plagiarism, but you can't actually tell me who I supposedly plagiarized from?" The professor's face reddened. "The burden of proof isn't on me, Mr. Wellington. If this is your work, you should be able to demonstrate that. I'm giving you the opportunity to explain yourself before I take this to the Academic Integrity Board. Derek stood there looking at this man who'd decided from day one that he didn't belong in this class, who'd dismissed his comments, mispronounced his name, and treated him like he was somehow less capable than every other student in the room. And now this, the ultimate insult, the assumption that good work couldn't possibly be his own. He could have gotten angry, could have yelled, could have stormed out. But Derek had learned a long time ago that anger was what people like Professor Hutchinson expected. They wanted you to get emotional so they could call you aggressive, so they could justify their prejudices. Instead, Derek pulled out his phone. You said some of my phrasing is similar to published critics? Yes, Professor Hutchinson said, looking confused by the question. Did you happen to check who those critics are? Like their actual names? As I said, I'd need to look up the specific articles, but did you check anyone named M.J. Wellington? Derek asked, his voice quiet but steady. The professor paused. That name sounds vaguely familiar. Why? Derek turned his phone around, showing his author website. The homepage featured his professional photo, the same face looking at Professor Hutchinson right now, just wearing a button-down shirt instead of a hoodie. Below the photo was a list of publications, 2 novels, 1 collection of literary essays, and more than a dozen articles in major journals and magazines. Professor Hutchinson's face went from red to white. He stared at the phone, then at Derek, then back at the phone. M.J. Wellington is my pen name, Derek said calmly. The initials stand for my middle and last name. I started publishing when I was 16. My first novel came out when I was 17.
My second one last year.
I've been writing professionally for 3 years now. Those critics you mentioned, the ones whose phrasing sounds like mine, it probably is mine, because I am one of those published critics. The professor opened and closed his mouth several times. No words came out. The university knows, Derek continued. They offered me a scholarship specifically because of my writing. It's in my file. The admissions office knew. The English department head knows. You would have known too if you'd bothered to read the incoming student information you were sent. Derek picked up his essay from the desk. This is my work. All of it, every word, every argument, every citation. And honestly, this isn't even close to my best writing. I dumbed it down because I didn't want to show off in a freshman class. I guess I should have dumbed it down even more, right? Made it match your expectations? Professor Hutchinson finally found his voice. I didn't know. The file must have. I received so many students. You didn't know because you didn't care to know, Derek said. From day one, you looked at me and decided who I was, what I was capable of. You dismissed everything I said in class discussions. You mispronounced my name every single day for 3 weeks. You treated me like I didn't belong here. And when I turned in good work, your first instinct wasn't to think maybe you judged me wrong. It was to assume I must have cheated. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Professor Hutchinson seemed to shrink in his chair, all his authority draining away. Derek stood tall, his phone still in his hand, his essay in the other. I'm going to leave now, Derek said, and I'm going to think about what I want to do next. But you should know that I'm not the first student you've treated this way. I've heard stories from other people in this department. People who look like me. People who didn't have publications to prove their worth. People who just left or switched majors, or learned to stay quiet because speaking up only got them shot down. He walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. The worst part is I actually love this subject. I love literature. I love analysis and theory and discussion. You almost ruined that for me. Almost, but I'm not going to let you. Derek opened the door and walked out, leaving Professor Hutchinson sitting alone in the empty classroom, still staring at the space where Derek had been standing, finally understanding just how badly he'd miscalculated. Derek didn't go back to his dorm right away. Instead, he walked around campus for almost an hour, trying to process everything that had just happened. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from the adrenaline of finally standing up for himself. Part of him felt victorious. Another part felt exhausted, and a small part felt sad that it had come to this at all. By the time he got back to his room, Chris was there along with Riley and Tyler. Apparently, Riley had texted the group chat about what happened after class, and word had spread fast. Are you okay? Riley asked immediately. Derek set his backpack down and sat on his bed. Yeah, I'm okay. Actually showed him my website. Turned out the published critics he thought I was copying from. That was me. He was accusing me of plagiarizing my own work. No way, Tyler said, his eyes going wide. What did he say? Not much. Just kind of sat there looking shocked. I told him what I thought of how he'd been treating me and left. Chris grinned. I wish I could have seen his face, but Riley looked worried. Derek, you need to report this. Like, officially. This isn't just about you being right. He falsely accused you of plagiarism. That's serious. And if he's done this to other students. She was right, and Derek knew it. That night he lay awake thinking about all the students who'd come before him in Professor Hutchinson's classes. How many had been treated the same way? How many had just accepted it? Thinking maybe the professor was right, maybe they didn't belong in advanced classes. The next morning, Derek sent an email to Dr. Patricia Hayes, the English department chair. He kept it factual and professional, outlining what had happened and offering to provide documentation. He also mentioned that other students had witnessed Professor Hutchinson's pattern of behavior throughout the semester. Dr. Hayes responded within 2 hours, asking him to come to her office that afternoon. The meeting was intense. Dr. Hayes, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, listened to everything Derek had to say. She took notes. She asked questions, and she looked increasingly concerned as the story unfolded. I'm going to be honest with you, she said when Derek finished. This is not the first complaint we've received about Professor Hutchinson, but previous complaints have been vague. Students saying they felt dismissed or uncomfortable, but nothing concrete. What you're describing, especially the plagiarism accusation, that's concrete. That's actionable. What happens now? Derek asked. Now I need to conduct a proper investigation. I'll need to speak with Professor Hutchinson. I'll also need to interview other students from your class to corroborate the pattern of behavior you've described. Are you willing to put this in writing? A formal statement? Derek nodded. Yes, but I want you to know I'm not doing this just for me. I'm doing it because I don't want other students to go through this. Dr. Hayes smiled slightly. I know, I read your file when you were admitted. Your work speaks for itself. The fact that Professor Hutchinson didn't bother to look at that file tells me everything I need to know about his approach to teaching. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Dr. Hayes interviewed Riley, Tyler, Jessica, and several other students from the class. Their accounts were remarkably consistent. Professor Hutchinson had a pattern of dismissing certain students, particularly students of color, while praising others for similar contributions. He made assumptions about capability based on appearance. He created an environment where some students felt comfortable participating and others felt constantly judged. Then, things got bigger. Dr. Hayes expanded her investigation to include students from previous semesters. Once people heard that someone was finally listening, more stories came forward. A Hispanic student who'd been accused of having someone else write his papers because they were too good for someone from his background. An Asian student who'd been told her insights about Asian American literature were too personal and not academic enough. A Black woman who'd eventually switched majors because Professor Hutchinson made every class feel like a battle she couldn't win. The pattern was undeniable. Meanwhile, Derek's situation had become campus news, not because he'd reported it, but because other students had started talking. Someone had posted about the confrontation on social media, not naming names but describing the situation clearly enough that everyone in the English department knew what was going on. The post went viral within the campus community. The university's dean of students, Dr. Robert Chen, got involved. He called Derek in for a meeting along with Dr. Hayes and Professor Hutchinson. Derek almost didn't want to go. The thought of sitting in a room with Hutchinson after everything felt exhausting. But Riley reminded him that silence never changed anything. The meeting was held in the administration building, in a conference room with large windows overlooking the campus quad. Derek arrived first with Dr. Hayes. They sat on one side of the long table. A few minutes later, Professor Hutchinson entered with a lawyer from the university's legal department. He looked smaller somehow, his usual confidence completely gone. He couldn't meet Derek's eyes. Dean Chen arrived last. He was a serious man in his 60s who'd been at the university for 20 years. He laid out the situation with clinical precision, reading from Dr. Hayes's investigation report. The pattern of discriminatory behavior. The multiple student complaints spanning several years, the false accusation of plagiarism against Derek, the failure to review student files or treat all students equitably. Professor Hutchinson, Dean Chen said, "Do you dispute any of these findings?" The professor cleared his throat. I may have made some errors in judgment. I certainly didn't intend to make anyone feel targeted or uncomfortable. My teaching methods are perhaps old-fashioned, but this isn't about teaching methods," Dr. Hayes interrupted. "This is about discriminatory treatment of students based on your personal biases. Multiple students have described the same pattern. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a systemic problem." Professor Hutchinson's lawyer whispered something to him. He nodded stiffly. "I understand there have been complaints. I'm willing to undergo sensitivity training or whatever is recommended." Derek finally spoke up. "It's not just about you taking a training course and checking a box. You made students feel like they didn't belong in your classroom, like they weren't smart enough or good enough, just because of how they looked or where they came from. I had to prove I was a published author before you'd even consider that I might actually be intelligent. What about all the students who don't have publications, who are just regular college kids trying to learn? They deserve respect too." The room was quiet. Professor Hutchinson stared at the table. Dean Chen leaned forward. "Given the severity and consistency of these complaints and the particularly egregious nature of the false plagiarism accusation, I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave, Professor Hutchinson. Pending the completion of a formal investigation, you will not be teaching any classes. Your current students will be reassigned to other instructors." "What?" Professor Hutchinson's head snapped up. "You can't just—" "I can and I am," Dean Chen said firmly. "The university has a responsibility to provide a safe and equitable learning environment for all students. Your actions have violated that principle repeatedly. This is not negotiable." Professor Hutchinson looked like he wanted to argue, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm and shook his head. "As for you, Derek," Dean Chen continued, turning to him, "I want to personally apologize on behalf of the university. You came here to study and learn, and instead you were subjected to treatment that was both unprofessional and discriminatory. We're offering you the option to transfer to any other English literature course at your current tuition rate, or to continue with a new instructor who will be taking over Professor Hutchinson's class. What about the other students?" Derek asked. "The ones from previous years who went through this and never said anything?" Dr. Hayes spoke up. "We're reaching out to former students to offer them the opportunity to share their experiences. If academic opportunities were affected, we'll review their situations individually." Derek nodded slowly. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. More than that, it was acknowledgement that the problem was real, that his experience mattered. That change was necessary. As the meeting ended and people stood to leave, Professor Hutchinson finally looked directly at Derek. "I really didn't know," he said quietly. "About your publications, about who you are." Derek met his gaze steadily. "That's the point. You shouldn't have needed to know. You should have treated me with respect from day one, just like you treated everyone else. Not because I'm published, but because I'm a student in your class. Because I'm a person who deserves basic dignity." He left without waiting for a response. Outside in the hallway, Riley and Chris were waiting, having skipped their own classes to be there for moral support. They walked out of the building together into the afternoon sunshine, and for the first time in weeks, Derek felt like he could breathe properly. The hard part was over. But the real work, the work of changing a system that had allowed this to happen for years, that was just beginning. News of what happened spread beyond the campus faster than anyone expected. One of the students who'd posted about the situation on social media had connections to a local news blog that covered education issues. They reached out to Derek for an interview. He declined, not wanting to make it about himself. But the story ran anyway, based on public information and anonymous student accounts. The headline read, "Published author falsely accused of plagiarism by professor at Riverside University." Within days, it had been picked up by larger outlets. Educational forums started discussing the case. Social media lit up with people sharing their own experiences of being underestimated or discriminated against in academic settings. Derek tried to ignore most of it. He'd said what he needed to say in the dean's office. Now he just wanted to focus on his actual education. Dr. Hayes had assigned a different professor to take over their class, a younger woman named Dr. Linda Ramirez, who'd been teaching at a different university and just joined Riverside's faculty that semester. She was warm, enthusiastic, and treated every student's contribution like it mattered. The difference was immediately obvious. On her first day taking over the class, Dr. Ramirez introduced herself and acknowledged the difficult situation without dwelling on it. "I know the past few weeks have been challenging," she said. "My goal is to create a classroom where everyone feels valued and heard, where your ideas matter more than my preconceptions, where we learn from each other, not just from me lecturing at you." She meant it. Class discussions became actual discussions, not performances for the professor's approval. When Derek offered an analysis, she engaged with it thoughtfully, building on his ideas rather than dismissing them. When he was wrong about something, she corrected him gently, treating mistakes as learning opportunities rather than failures. Other students blossomed too, speaking up more freely, taking intellectual risks they'd been afraid to take before. Riley noticed the change immediately. "This is what college is supposed to feel like," she said after class one day. "I actually look forward to this class now instead of dreading it." But the situation with Professor Hutchinson wasn't over. The university's investigation continued, and more former students came forward. The stories were heartbreaking. Talented students who'd changed majors because one professor made them feel inadequate. First-generation college students who'd been told they weren't college material. International students whose accents had been mocked or whose contributions had been ignored. The English department held a town hall meeting to address the situation. Dean Chen was there, along with Dr. Hayes and several other faculty members. Students packed the room, sitting on the floor when the chairs ran out. The energy was intense but focused. People wanted answers. They wanted change. Dr. Hayes spoke first, outlining the steps the department was taking. Mandatory anti-bias training for all faculty, a new system for students to report concerns anonymously, regular reviews of teaching practices, a committee of students and faculty to develop guidelines for inclusive classroom environments. "But I want to be clear," Dr. Hayes said, her voice firm. "These policies only matter if we actually implement them. If we hold ourselves accountable, this isn't about checking boxes. It's about fundamentally changing how we approach education and how we treat every single student who walks through our doors." Then she asked Derek if he'd be willing to speak. He hadn't planned on it, but when he saw all those faces looking up at him, students who'd experienced similar things or who feared they might, he knew he needed to say something. He stood up, his heart pounding. "I'm not a public speaker," he began, which got a few sympathetic laughs. "I'm a writer. I'm better with written words than spoken ones. But I need to say this," he took a breath. "What happened to me with Professor Hutchinson hurt. It made me angry. But the worst part wasn't what he did to me. The worst part was realizing I wasn't alone, that there were other students, lots of them, who'd gone through the same thing or worse, who didn't have publications to point to, who just had to sit there and take it because they didn't think anyone would believe them." The room was completely silent. When I decided to report what happened, people asked me why I didn't just let it go. I'd proven my point. He knew he was wrong. Why push it? And the answer is because staying quiet doesn't protect anyone. It just lets the problem continue. The next student and the one after that, they'd go through the same thing, and maybe they wouldn't speak up either, because that's how these systems work. They count on people being too tired, too scared, too worried about rocking the boat. Derek looked around the room. "I'm not special because I'm published. I'm not more deserving of respect than any other student here. That's actually the whole point. Every single person in this room deserves to be treated with dignity. Your ideas deserve to be heard. Your perspectives matter. And if a professor or anyone else makes you feel like you don't belong, like you're not smart enough, like you have to constantly prove your worth just to be treated like everyone else, that's not on you. That's on them. And it's on all of us to call it out when we see it." When he sat down, the room erupted in applause. Several people were crying. Riley grabbed his hand and squeezed it. Chris, sitting in the back, gave him a thumbs up with both hands. The town hall continued for another hour, with students and faculty sharing ideas and concerns. It felt productive, like real change might actually be possible. But Derek knew from experience that the real test would come in the following months and years. Would these promises be kept? Would things actually improve? As for Professor Hutchinson, the investigation concluded 3 weeks later. The findings were damning: years of discriminatory behavior, multiple complaints that had been minimized or ignored, a clear pattern of treating students differently based on race and socioeconomic background. The university gave him two options: resign voluntarily or be terminated. He chose to resign. Some people thought that was too lenient. Others argued that his reputation was destroyed anyway, which was punishment enough. Derek tried not to think about it too much. The professor's fate wasn't his responsibility. His responsibility was to himself, to his education, and to the example he set for other students. The semester continued. Derek threw himself into his coursework, finally able to enjoy learning without the constant undercurrent of tension. His essay, the one that had started everything, got an A from Dr. Ramirez along with detailed feedback that actually helped him improve his writing. She didn't know he was a published author when she graded it. She just evaluated the work on its merits. During finals week, Derek was approached by the university's diversity office. They wanted to know if he'd be interested in becoming a peer mentor for incoming students of color. The program would train him to help new students navigate campus, advocate for themselves, and connect with resources. He said yes immediately. He also started working on a new book, not about what happened, not exactly, but about the experience of being constantly underestimated, of having to prove yourself over and over, of the exhaustion that comes with fighting just to be seen as equal. It was cathartic, putting those feelings into fiction, creating characters who went through similar struggles and found their own ways to overcome them. Riley and Tyler became his closest friends that year. They studied together, complained about other classes together, and had long debates about books and writing and what literature could do to change the world. Chris remained his roommate and became his first reader for everything he wrote, offering brutally honest feedback that made his work better. When spring semester rolled around, Derek signed up for Dr. Ramirez's Contemporary American Literature course. On the first day, a new group of students filed in looking nervous and excited in the way freshmen always do. Derek watched them, remembering how he'd felt 8 months ago, full of hope and uncertainty, not knowing what to expect. Dr. Ramirez started class the same way she always did, with warmth and enthusiasm. "Welcome," she said. "I'm so glad you're here. In this class, every voice matters. Every perspective is valuable. We're going to learn from each other, challenge each other, and grow together. Some of you might feel like you don't belong in an advanced literature course. I'm here to tell you that if you want to be here, you belong. Your thoughts matter. Your insights matter. You matter." Derek saw some of the students sit up a little straighter, relief visible on their faces. One kid in the back, wearing a hoodie and looking uncertain, made eye contact with Derek and gave a small nod. Derek nodded back, a silent message of solidarity and understanding. After class, that same student approached him. "Hey, aren't you Derek Wellington? The writer?" Derek smiled. "Yeah, that's me. I read your book last summer. The one about the kid trying to make it in the music industry. It was really good. Made me feel like, I don't know, like my story mattered too, you know?" "That's the whole point," Derek said. "Everyone's story matters." They talked for a few more minutes, and Derek found himself giving advice about college, about writing, about not letting anyone make you feel small. It felt good, being able to help someone who reminded him so much of himself. That evening, Derek got an email from his publisher. His second novel, the one that had come out the previous year, had been nominated for a Young Adult Literary Award. It was a prestigious honor, the kind of thing that could really boost a writing career. He stared at the email for a long time, feeling grateful and overwhelmed and a little bit vindicated. He thought about Professor Hutchinson briefly, about how the man had looked at him on that first day of class and decided he wasn't worth taking seriously, about how that assumption had nearly derailed Derek's entire semester, about how many other students had suffered similar treatment and never got the chance to prove themselves. But mostly Derek thought about the future, about the book he was writing, about the students he'd mentor, about the changes happening at the university, about Dr. Ramirez and the kind of teacher she was, the kind of educational environment she created. That was what mattered. Not the Professor Hutchinsons of the world, but the people working to build something better. His phone buzzed with a text from Riley. "Pizza and bad movies at my place tonight." "You in?" he texted back. "Definitely." As Derek packed up his stuff and headed out into the warm spring evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in months: peace. Not because everything was perfect or because all the problems were solved, but because he'd stood up for himself and others. Because he'd used his voice to create change. Because he'd proven, not to Professor Hutchinson but to himself, that he was exactly where he belonged. The title of his new book, the one he was writing, had come to him that morning. Seen. It was about visibility, about recognition, about the fight to be acknowledged not despite who you are but because of it, about the exhausting work of existing in spaces that weren't designed for you, but also about resilience, community, and the small victories that add up to real change. He dedicated to every student who'd ever been underestimated. Every kid who'd been told they weren't smart enough, weren't good enough, didn't belong. Every person who'd proven the doubters wrong, and every person still fighting to be seen. Because Derek understood now, more clearly than ever, that his story wasn't just about one professor's prejudice or one student's vindication. It was about something bigger. It was about systems that needed changing, voices that needed amplifying, and the courage it took to speak up even when silence would be easier. The book would be published the following year. It would become his first bestseller, optioned for a limited series and taught in universities around the country, including eventually at Riverside University, where a new generation of students would read it in Dr. Ramirez's class and see themselves in its pages. But that night, walking across campus to meet his friends, Derek didn't know any of that yet. He just knew that he'd survived something difficult, learned something important, and come out stronger on the other side. And sometimes that was enough.